there's a name carved into the landscape of Louisiana that most people recognize as romantic legend. Jean Lafitte, the gentleman pirate who saved New Orleans. But strip away the romance and you're left with something else entirely. A man who built an empire on human trafficking. A smuggler who exploited a legal loophole to buy and sell the same people twice. A businessman whose fortune came from enslaved Africans sold at prices determined by the pound. The same year that Congress banned the international slave trade, Jean Lafitte saw an opportunity. While America declared that importing human beings would no longer be tolerated, Lafitte organized a network that would smuggle thousands of enslaved Africans into Louisiana over the next decade. He built warehouses to store stolen goods and pens to hold people. He established auction houses in the swamps where plantation owners came to buy human beings at bargain prices. And when authorities finally caught his smuggled captives, Lafitte had already figured out how to profit from that too. This is the story of Jean Lafitte, and how the slave trade made him one of the wealthiest criminals in the Gulf of Mexico. Very little about Jean Lafitte's early life can be stated with certainty, and that ambiguity would serve him well throughout his career. He was likely born around 1780, possibly in France, possibly in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, possibly somewhere else entirely. Historian H.W. Brands noted that Lafitte was French, Spanish, or Jewish, depending on who was asking. In Lafitte's disputed memoir, he claimed to have been born in Bordeaux in 1780 to Sephardic Jewish parents whose family had fled Spain to escape the Inquisition. Other accounts place his birth in Bayonne, Brest, or even New York. When Lafitte applied for a privateering license in 1813, he gave his age as 32 and named Bordeaux as his birthplace. What we know for certain is that by the early 1800s, Jean Lafitte and his older brother Pierre had arrived in Louisiana. Their father had been a merchant, and both brothers appeared to have spent considerable time at sea. By 1803, Pierre had reached New Orleans, and Jean likely joined him by 1805. They opened what popular legend calls a blacksmith shop on Bourbon Street, though historians now believe this romantic detail is almost certainly false. Neither brother was ever actually a blacksmith. What they were, however, was merchants dealing in contraband. Pierre began working in the slave trade in 1804, just 4 years before Congress would make it illegal. In the winter of 1805 to 1806, Pierre sold 11 enslaved people he had purchased in Baton Rouge, which was then located in Spanish West Florida, where slavery was still legal. The foreign slave trade was illegal in United States territory, but across the border, Spanish subjects could lawfully import people from Africa. The next year, Pierre traveled to Spanish Pensacola, bought more enslaved people, and again shipped them to New Orleans. The brothers had discovered a profitable business model built on jurisdictional boundaries and legal loopholes. By November 1809, Jean had joined his brother in New Orleans, and one resident referred to him as the notorious Captain Lafitte, suggesting he had already achieved a level of notoriety, probably stemming from his activities in the slave trade. Jean reportedly imported enslaved people who had been captured by illegal Spanish privateers, smuggling them into Louisiana through isolated spots along the coast. Rather than operating his own vessel initially, Jean may have been working as a middleman between the privateers and his brother Pierre, who marketed the enslaved men, women, and children in and around New Orleans. Then came 1807, and 2 pieces of federal legislation that would transform the Lafitte brothers' operation into something far more organized and far more profitable. First, the United States passed the Embargo Act, which barred American ships from docking at any foreign port and imposed an embargo on goods imported into the country. It was specifically intended to prohibit trade with Great Britain as tensions increased between the two nations. For New Orleans merchants who had depended on trade with Caribbean colonies, this was a disaster. Suddenly, there was a shortage of luxury goods, and anyone who could smuggle in silks, spices, furniture, and other European merchandise could command premium prices. Second, and more significantly for the Lafittes, came January 1, 1808, when the act prohibiting the importation of slaves took effect. The Constitution had explicitly prevented Congress from banning the importation of enslaved people before 1808, and now that restriction had expired. The new law imposed heavy penalties on anyone engaged in the international slave trade. It did not end slavery within the United States or the domestic slave trade, but it did cut off the supply of enslaved people from Africa and the Caribbean. The economic impact was immediate. Louisiana enslavers experienced a sharp rise in the cost of enslaved labor. People born in the United States were now considered less likely to run away, and therefore commanded higher prices. Without the international trade, enslavers also forced higher birth rates on enslaved women, placing their lives at even greater risk. For the Lafitte brothers, the 1808 prohibition didn't represent a moral line to respect, but rather a business opportunity to exploit. The Lafittes needed a base of operations beyond the reach of American law enforcement. They found it in Barataria Bay, a labyrinth of swamps, bayous, and barrier islands, about 50 miles south of New Orleans. The bay was located beyond a narrow passage between the barrier islands of Grande Terre and Grande Isle. This area had been used for smuggling even before the Lafittes arrived, but they would transform it into something unprecedented. A full-scale criminal enterprise with infrastructure, organization, and thousands of participants. By 1810, the Lafittes had established their headquarters on Grande Terre Island. Jean spent most of his time there, managing the daily operations, while Pierre remained in New Orleans as the silent partner, looking after their interests in the city and maintaining connections with the merchants, plantation owners, and even customs officials who would become their customers. The Barataria operation employed as many as 1,000 people at its peak, including sailors, privateers, laborers, and free people of color. Some were even freedom seekers who had escaped enslavement themselves, but now found themselves working for an operation that trafficked in human beings. Throughout Barataria, Lafitte built the infrastructure of his smuggling empire. He constructed warehouses to store luxury goods seized from merchant vessels. More ominously, he built pens to hold enslaved people captive while awaiting sale. These holding areas were essentially prisons, where kidnapped Africans were kept in inhumane conditions between their arrival in Barataria and their eventual auction. Merchants, planters, and enslavers came to Barataria for these auctions, which Lafitte held outside New Orleans to avoid the law. His knowledge of the intricate waterways of southern Louisiana meant he could always make quick getaways when authorities approached. The Lafitte's source of enslaved people came primarily from privateers. In 1809, the business expanded significantly when Jean joined his brother, and they found a new supply. French privateers who had been commissioned to attack Britain, France's enemy in the Napoleonic Wars. The Lafittes set up operations in Barataria, resupplied the privateers, and moved their captured goods and enslaved people into Louisiana. By 1811, New privateers arrived bearing commissions from Spanish-American governments seeking independence from Spain, providing yet another source of captured slave ships. The process worked like this. The Lafitte's vessels, or the privateers they worked with, would intercept Spanish slave ships traveling from Africa to Caribbean markets. These ships carried hundreds of enslaved Africans in horrific conditions, packed into holds designed to maximize the number of human beings transported. The privateers would seize these ships, and the enslaved people aboard would be transferred to Lafitte's operation in Barataria. In January 1813, Lafitte's men captured a British hermaphrodite brig loaded with 77 enslaved people. The sale of these people and the ship's other cargo generated $18,000 in profits, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. At Barataria, enslaved people were held in pens until auction day. Merchants and plantation owners from New Orleans and the surrounding area would travel through the bayous to attend these sales. The auctions were conducted in the open air, with enslaved men, women, and children displayed like livestock. Buyers could inspect them, checking teeth, muscles, and overall health before making their purchases. Prices were often calculated by weight, literally selling human beings by the pound. Because these sales occurred outside the formal legal system and avoided customs duties and taxes, Lafitte could undercut legitimate slave markets and still make enormous profits. The scale of Lafitte's operation was staggering. Annual income from Barataria reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and later, at his Galveston operation, would exceed $2 million annually in today's terms. Much of this wealth came directly from the slave trade. According to one account from 1853, written by John Bowie and published in DuBose magazine, his brothers Rezin and James Bowie purchased enslaved people from Lafitte and channeled their illicit trade via Black Bayou on Lake Sabine and via the Calcasieu to Lake Charles, realizing a net profit of $65,000 in 2 years from the sale of 1,500 Africans in Louisiana. That's 1,500 human lives reduced to a financial transaction, 1,500 people torn from their families and sold into slavery in American fields. But Lafitte's most ingenious scheme came after Louisiana authorities started cracking down on smuggling. Louisiana law in the early 1800s included a provision intended to encourage informants to report smuggling. Anyone who reported contraband, including illegally imported enslaved people, would receive half the value of that contraband once it was sold at public auction. Customs officials would seize the smuggled goods or people, auction them off, and split the proceeds with the informant. Lafitte saw the opportunity immediately, and he partnered with the Bowie brothers to exploit this loophole. Here's how the scheme worked. The Bowies would report Lafitte's smuggled enslaved people to Louisiana officials, claiming the reward. The authorities would seize these people and schedule them for public auction. Before the auction, the Bowies would threaten other potential buyers with violence, ensuring no one else would bid. With no other bidders, prices stayed artificially low. Lafitte or the Bowies could then purchase the enslaved people back at these depressed prices, collecting their share of the reward in the process. Now, these same people had documentation showing they'd been legally sold through a government auction. The Lafittes and Bowies would then turn around and sell them again at full market prices. Think about what this meant for the enslaved people caught in this system. They were captured once, smuggled into the country illegally, held in pens in Barataria, then seized by authorities and sold at auction. Even though federal law prohibited their importation, They weren't freed, but rather labeled as contraband, and sold into slavery anyway. Then they were purchased again and sold a third time. Each transaction generated profit for Lafitte, and his partners, and each transaction moved these human beings further into the system of American slavery with less and less chance of escape. James Bowie, who would later become famous for the knife bearing his name and for his death at the Alamo, was among Lafitte's best customers. From about 1817 to 1821, Bowie worked directly with Lafitte, who was then headquartered on Galveston Island. Lafitte would capture slave ships in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, then transfer the human cargo to Bowie, who sold them in New Orleans and other cities along the Mississippi River. The Bowie brothers used these profits to become land speculators, building a fortune on the backs of enslaved people. Lafitte built additional infrastructure to support the trade. Later, he constructed a shelter near the Sabine River to sell enslaved people closer to Louisiana, avoiding the journey through Barataria. He established camps in the Neutral Strip, that 40-mile-wide stretch of wilderness in present-day Calcasieu and Cameron parishes that existed because the boundary between Spanish Texas and the United States was in dispute. This area was left unoccupied by troops and law enforcement from either nation from 1806 to 1821, making it perfect for illegal operations. Lafitte built at least 2 slave barracks in the Neutral Strip by December 1817, one on Contraband Bayou, a tributary of the Calcasieu, and another at Belle Island. Meanwhile, the Lafittes maintained their veneer of respectability in New Orleans. They cultivated relationships with influential merchants, politicians, and even some customs officials who looked the other way or actively participated in the trade. The smuggled goods flooding into New Orleans undercut legitimate businesses, but kept prices low for consumers, making Lafitte popular among ordinary residents who could now afford luxuries they otherwise couldn't. He was described by those who met him as handsome, well-dressed, charming, and gentlemanly. The nickname the Gentleman Pirate stuck, even as he built his fortune on the systematic trafficking of human beings. Several times, customs officials and soldiers tried to capture Lafitte in the swamps of Barataria, but they were usually captured, wounded, or killed by the Baratarians first. Lafitte's men knew every inlet and hidden passage, giving them a decisive advantage. In 1812, several Baratarians, including both Pierre and Jean Lafitte, were captured, but they made bail and disappeared. Governor William C. Claiborne took a leave of absence in September 1810, and the acting governor, Thomas Robertson, was incensed by Lafitte's operation. Robertson called his men brigands who infest our coast and overrun our country. Then came the War of 1812, and with it, the opportunity for Lafitte to transform his public image from criminal to patriot, at least temporarily. In September 1814, British military officials sought Lafitte's help in their campaign to attack the United States from the Gulf of Mexico. They needed someone with intimate knowledge of the bayous and waterways around New Orleans. The British offered Lafitte £30,000, more than $2 million in today's money, along with the position of captain in the British Navy and amnesty from prosecution for his crimes. Lafitte asked for 2 weeks to consider the offer, then wrote to Louisiana Governor Claiborne offering his services to defend New Orleans in exchange for pardons for his men. In his letter, Lafitte pleaded that while he may have been on the wrong side of the law from time to time, he was, deep down, a good man and a patriot. It was classic Lafitte, positioning himself to benefit regardless of the outcome, but also demonstrating genuine strategic value, Governor Claiborne was inclined to accept, but the Louisiana legislature rejected Lafitte's proposition. The decision was made moot when United States naval forces, led by Commodore Daniel Patterson, raided and destroyed Lafitte's base at Barataria in September 1814. They captured several Baratarians, seized ships and contraband worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and effectively shut down the operation. Pierre was arrested and jailed in New Orleans, though he mysteriously escaped in September. But as British forces approached New Orleans in late 1814 and early 1815, General Andrew Jackson reconsidered. Although Jackson initially described Lafitte as a hellish banditti, he recognized the value of Lafitte's knowledge of the terrain, his artillery expertise, and the ammunition he could provide. Jackson finally accepted Lafitte's offer. About 50 Baratarians manned guns on American battleships and operated terrestrial batteries during the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815. Their expert cannon fire contributed to the American victory. After the battle, Jackson paid tribute to the Lafitte brothers' efforts in his dispatches. In February 1815, President James Madison offered pardons to the Baratarians for any crimes committed against the United States. This presidential pardon gave Lafitte and his men a clean slate. Many Baratarians settled in New Orleans or the Barataria area, and some of their descendants still live there today. But Lafitte didn't stay on the straight and narrow for long. Rather than truly change his ways, he simply moved his operation beyond American jurisdiction. By 1817, Lafitte had sailed to Galveston Island in Spanish Texas. The island was strategically located, largely ungoverned, and perfect for his purposes. When Lafitte arrived, he found a small colony already established by Louis-Michel Ory, another privateer. While Ory was away assisting the Mexican independence movement, Lafitte simply took over. He named his settlement Campeche, after a prominent Mexican port on the Yucatan Peninsula. Under Lafitte's leadership, Campeche grew rapidly. His men tore down existing structures and built 200 new, sturdier buildings. The settlement included housing for pirates, a large slave market, boarding houses for visiting buyers, a shipyard, saloons, stores, gambling houses, and Lafitte's own mansion, known as Maison Rouge, the Red House. At its peak, the colony had more than 2,000 inhabitants and 120 separate structures. Annual income reached more than $2 million in stolen currency and goods. Lafitte essentially ran Galveston as an autonomous state. He interviewed all newcomers and required them to take an oath of loyalty to him. He established a judicial system with 5 presiding judges to deal with men who deviated from his rules. Those found guilty were sometimes hanged. Lafitte conducted most of his business aboard his ship, the Pride, where he also lived. To give his operation a veneer of legitimacy, he forged letters of marque from an imaginary nation, fraudulently authorizing all ships sailing from Galveston as privateers with permission to attack vessels from all nations. The slave trade continued unabated at Galveston. Lafitte's operations reached an industrial scale, with barracoons on the island often swelled beyond capacity, containing 1,000 or more enslaved Africans at a time. Buyers came directly to Galveston to purchase people at $1 per pound. The Bowie brothers remained among Lafitte's best customers, channeling their trade through the neutral strip and realizing enormous profits. Lafitte also managed to create space for the indigenous Karankawa people initially. The Karankawa had lived on Galveston Island for generations. At first, Lafitte's pirates and the Karankawa traded and mingled socially. But tensions grew as the two groups tried to live with separate interests on the same small island. After disagreements escalated, Lafitte's men battled the Karankawa in what locals called the Battle of Three Trees. This show of force effectively drove the indigenous population off the island, adding yet another dark chapter to Lafitte's legacy. But Lafitte's luck at Galveston couldn't last. In the summer of 1818, a powerful hurricane decimated the island, destroying virtually all the buildings and putting the entire settlement underwater. The colony had to be rebuilt from scratch. More significantly, Lafitte's men began attacking American merchant vessels. In late 1819, one of his captains, Louis Randon, captured the American schooner General Ramirez. These attacks on American shipping couldn't be ignored. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams demanded that Spain evacuate Lafitte's unauthorized settlement from Texas. Spain, lacking effective control over the territory, couldn't or wouldn't act. So, in April 1820, the United States Navy dispatched the sloop USS Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant Lawrence Kearney, to Galveston with an ultimatum: disband the base within 3 months or face military action. Lafitte assessed the situation pragmatically. The Enterprise's firepower and the inevitability of confrontation with American naval superiority meant resistance would be futile. He opted for evacuation without a fight to preserve his fleet and personnel. By early May 1820, Lafitte had ordered his remaining men to burn the settlement to the ground. He held a massive party with wine and whiskey, then watched Campeche burn. On the morning after, he sailed his small remaining fleet into the Gulf of Mexico, never to return to the Texas coast. John and Pierre didn't quit the slave trade even after leaving Galveston. In 1821, near Havana, they captured a ship carrying 200 enslaved people. Slave smuggling was simply too lucrative for the Lafittes to give up. Over the next few months, Lafitte established a base along the coast of Cuba, bribing local officials with shares of the profits. He continued to patrol the shipping lanes, alternating between piracy and privateering as circumstances allowed. In late April 1822, Lafitte was captured after taking his first American ship since Galveston. An American warship turned him over to Cuban authorities, who promptly released him. When Lafitte and other pirates began attacking merchant ships carrying legal goods to Cuba, Cuban officials grew angry. By the end of 1822, Cuba had banned all forms of sea raiding. Lafitte needed yet another commission to continue operating with even the thinnest veneer of legitimacy. In June 1822, Lafitte approached officials in Colombia, whose government, under Simón Bolívar, had begun commissioning former privateers as officers in its new navy. Lafitte was granted a commission and given a 43-ton schooner named General Santander in honor of Colombia's vice president. For the first time in years, Lafitte was legally authorized to take Spanish ships. He continued to patrol the shipping lanes around Cuba, and in November 1822, he even made positive news in the American press after escorting an American schooner through pirate-infested waters and providing them with extra cannonballs and food. But Lafitte's story was approaching its end. In February 1823, he was cruising off the town of Omoa, Honduras, on the General Santander. Omoa was the site of the largest Spanish fort in Central America, built to guard Spanish silver shipments from the mines of Tegucigalpa. On the night of February 4th, Lafitte attempted to take what appeared to be 2 Spanish merchant vessels. It was cloudy with low visibility. The Spanish ships appeared to be fleeing, so Lafitte pursued. At 10 o'clock that night, the Spanish ships suddenly turned back for a frontal counterattack. They weren't merchant vessels at all, but heavily armed privateers or warships. They returned devastating fire. In the battle, Lafitte was wounded. He died just after dawn on February 5, 1823, at approximately age 43. He was buried at sea in the Gulf of Honduras. Two Colombian newspapers, the Gaceta de Cartagena and the Gaceta de Colombia, carried obituaries noting the loss of this brave naval officer. No American newspaper published an obituary. The legend of Jean Lafitte began to grow almost immediately after his death, and it quickly overwhelmed the historical reality. Writers romanticized him as a dashing anti-hero, a Robin Hood figure who fought against oppressive governments and helped save American independence. The fact that he aided Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans became the centerpiece of his legacy, with his decades of slave trading often reduced to a footnote or omitted entirely. Treasure hunters began searching for buried gold throughout the Gulf Coast, convinced that Lafitte had hidden his wealth. Ghost stories proliferated, with people claiming to see his spirit at various locations. By the mid-19th century and into the 20th, Lafitte had been thoroughly sanitized in popular culture. Lord Byron may have based his poem The Corsair on Lafitte. Novelists, playwrights, and eventually filmmakers portrayed him as a romantic figure, emphasizing his charm, his military contributions, and his supposed code of honor while downplaying or ignoring his role in human trafficking. The Louisiana Pirate Festival, which began in Lake Charles and eventually became known as Contraband Days, celebrated Lafitte as a colorful local character. The Lafitte name became ubiquitous along the Gulf Coast despite the reality of what it represented. There are the towns of Lafitte and Jean Lafitte, Louisiana, connected by Jean Lafitte Boulevard. The Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve encompasses 6 sites across a 200-mile swath of South Louisiana, including the Barataria Preserve, where Lafitte once held enslaved people in pens awaiting sale. The Lafitte Greenway Linear Park opened in New Orleans with hopes of urban revitalization. Private establishments named after Lafitte include the Lafitte Hotel, Café Lafitte in Exile, and Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop Bar, which trades on the romantic fiction that the Lafittes actually operated a blacksmith shop there. The University of New Orleans sports teams were called the Privateers, and until 2017, they were cheered on by a mascot called Lafitte the Instigator. A historical marker stands at the approximate site of Lafitte's Galveston headquarters. Tourism operators offer Jean Lafitte swamp tours and pirate-themed excursions. The legend has proven remarkably durable, but in recent years, historians and community members have begun to reckon more honestly with Lafitte's legacy. As scholar William Davis writes, once the Lafitte brothers were gone, there was little left by which to remember them except stories that quickly grew into legend. Pirates and privateers were by nature profligate. They didn't hide or bury money or treasure. When they got money, they spent it, then went after more. Virtually all of them died poor. The Lafitte's impact on their times was actually minimal. The Battle of New Orleans would have been won without them. Galveston Island would have been settled without them. Their chief impact on Louisiana's history was as folk heroes, their legend quickly overwhelming the reality of their lives. That reality was the systematic trafficking in human beings. During his career from approximately 1804 to 1821, Jean Lafitte was directly responsible for the enslavement of thousands of people. The exact number will never be known because smuggling operations by their nature don't keep complete records. But we know that John Bowie recorded 1,500 people sold through just one 2-year period via the Bowie Brothers operation alone. We know that Lafitte's barracoons in Galveston sometimes held more than 1,000 people at once. We know that in a single incident in January 1813, his men captured a ship with 77 enslaved people, and in 1821, they captured another ship with 200. Each of those numbers represents individual human beings torn from their homes in Africa, packed into the holds of ships for the Middle Passage, then smuggled into Louisiana or Texas and sold like livestock. Many died in the horrific conditions of the ships. Others died in the pens at Barataria or Galveston, waiting for buyers. Those who survived to be sold faced lives of forced labor, separated from families, subjected to violence, and denied basic human dignity. Their children would be born into slavery. Their grandchildren would be born into slavery. The ripple effects of Lafitte's trafficking extended across generations. Consider the perspective of one of those people held in Lafitte's pens in Barataria. You've survived the nightmare of the Middle Passage. You arrive in what you're told is America, land of freedom, only to be imprisoned in a swamp, surrounded by mosquitoes and snakes, waiting to be sold. Maybe you're purchased by the Bowie brothers. Maybe you're seized by authorities, auctioned off, then purchased again by the same people who just turned you in. Maybe you end up on a cotton plantation or a sugar plantation in Louisiana's brutal heat. You work from sunrise to sunset. You're beaten if you don't work fast enough. You watch your children sold away from you. And somewhere, Jean Lafitte is being celebrated as a patriot, a hero, a gentleman pirate. The romanticization of Lafitte isn't just historically inaccurate. It's an insult to the thousands of people whose lives he destroyed. Historian David Head argues that while there may be room for debate about how we remember complex historical figures, like Andrew Jackson, who owned slaves but also had other significant contributions, there's no such ambiguity with the Lafittes. They were unrepentant slave traders, skilled at manipulating international conflicts and borders to their advantage. Yes, the Lafittes of legend are lovable rogues, but the reality was far different. The question of what to do with Lafitte's name in public spaces has sparked debate in recent years. After the 2020 renewed national reckoning with monuments and memorials to figures connected with slavery and racism, some voices called for removing Lafitte's name from parks, streets, and businesses. The argument is straightforward. If we're removing statues of Confederate generals and renaming schools that honored slave owners, shouldn't we also reconsider honoring a man whose primary business was human trafficking? Others argue that Lafitte's case is different because he has no statue, because his legend has become intertwined with local culture and identity, or because removing his name would erase an important part of history, even if that history is uncomfortable. There's also the practical reality that Lafitte's name appears on federal property, like the National Historical Park, on multiple municipalities, and on dozens of private businesses. Changing all of those names would be a massive undertaking. But perhaps the issue isn't whether Lafitte's name should be removed from every location, but rather how his story is told when it is told. The Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, operated by the National Park Service, has taken steps in recent years to present a more complete and honest history. Exhibits now explicitly address Lafitte's role in the slave trade, describing the mechanics of his smuggling operation and the legal schemes he used to profit from human trafficking. The Park Service's website states clearly that Lafitte and the Bowie brothers ensured both smuggling parties received profit through their exploitation of loopholes in the law, and that enslaved people were the ones who suffered. This more honest approach doesn't require removing Lafitte from history. It requires telling the truth about who he was and what he did. It means acknowledging that the legend of the gentleman pirate is just that, a legend. The real Jean Lafitte was a businessman who saw human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. He was clever, certainly. He was strategic and well-connected. He knew how to exploit legal loopholes and jurisdictional boundaries. He had enough charm to convince people he was a patriot rather than a criminal. But none of that changes the fundamental nature of his enterprise. Lafitte's story also illuminates something larger about how the slave trade actually worked in early 19th century America. We often think of the slave trade as something that happened before 1808, when Congress banned it. The truth is that the illegal slave trade flourished after 1808, sustained by smugglers like Lafitte, who found ways around the law. The demand for enslaved labor in the expanding cotton and sugar economies of the Deep South was so great that people were willing to pay premium prices for smuggled human beings. And the legal system, despite the 1808 prohibition, actually facilitated this by treating seized enslaved people as contraband to be sold rather than as human beings to be freed. The Louisiana Purchase had opened vast new territories to American settlement and agricultural development. The cotton gin had made large-scale cotton production economically viable. Sugar plantations in Louisiana demanded enormous amounts of labor. All of this created an insatiable demand for workers, and in a slave economy, that meant demand for enslaved people. The domestic slave trade, which remained legal, couldn't meet this demand. So smugglers stepped in to fill the gap. Lafitte's operation was one of many, but it was perhaps the largest and most organized. His success depended on a network of participants and beneficiaries that extended far beyond his immediate circle of pirates and smugglers. Plantation owners provided the demand and the money. Merchants in New Orleans bought smuggled goods and sometimes enslaved people. Some customs officials looked the other way or actively participated in schemes to profit from seized contraband. Politicians granted pardons and accepted bribes. Society as a whole benefited from lower prices on imported goods, even knowing those goods were smuggled. This is what makes the romanticization of Lafitte particularly troubling. It's not just that we're celebrating a slave trader, it's that we're obscuring the systemic nature of the crime. Lafitte wasn't an aberration or a rogue actor operating outside society. He was deeply embedded in the economic and social networks of his time. His customers were respectable plantation owners. His partners included people who would go on to become celebrated figures in American history, like James Bowie. His operation relied on the tacit acceptance or active cooperation of government officials. Treating Lafitte as a colorful pirate character lets everyone else off the hook. The economic impact of Lafitte's trafficking is difficult to quantify precisely, but we can make some estimates. At $1 per pound, an average adult male weighing 170 pounds would sell for $170. In 1820, that was roughly equivalent to $5,000 today, though the actual purchasing power was different. If Lafitte trafficked 3,000 people over his career, a conservative estimate, that represents modern equivalent revenue in the millions from the slave trade alone. The human cost, of course, is incalculable. What becomes of a society that celebrates such a figure? What does it say about our values when we name parks and streets after slave traders, even if we've added educational plaques explaining the fuller story? these are questions each community must grapple with for itself. There's no easy answer that respects both historical memory and human dignity. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Jean Lafitte's legacy isn't a park or a festival, but rather a clear-eyed acknowledgement of what he represents. He represents the banality of evil, the way ordinary business practices can inflict extraordinary suffering when human beings are treated as property. He represents the gap between legend and reality, the way societies construct myths to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. He represents the persistence of injustice even in the face of laws meant to prevent it, and he represents the need for continued vigilance about how we tell our history and whom we choose to celebrate. Jean Lafitte died at approximately age 43, buried at sea in the Gulf of Honduras. His wealth disappeared with him because he spent it as fast as he made it. He left no empire, no lasting infrastructure, no positive contribution to society. What he left was thousands of lives destroyed, families torn apart, and generations born into slavery because of his trafficking. The legend may have overwhelmed the reality for 2 centuries, but the reality remains. Jean Lafitte was a slave trader. That's not a footnote to his story. That is his story.